Welcome everybody to the online version of Cartographies guest lecture by me, your TA, Lily Crandall-Orrell. I'm a MA student in the department and I study cartography, counter-cartographies, different mapping practices, and much more. So I'm going to share my screen now and present Counter-Cartography, my guest lecture. Feel welcome to grab this link here and follow along. The link was also sent out in the announcement, but this is a very interactive page. So everything is linked to a map or a place you can find more information. And at the end, we do an activity and you're welcome to upload pictures of your maps or hand-drawn sketches to this site. And comment on one another's work. So counter-cartography is a broad term, and it, for me, describes critical creative maps and their mapping practices that counter conventionally accepted ways of rendering space and also moving through space. Counter-cartography is critical, it can be creative, and it's really quite radical. Critical cartography is a whole way of thinking, and it emerged as a defined theoretical and practical critique in the 1990s, but maps and mapping practices as a form of political protest had been being used decades before. So in this lecture, we're going to explore maps and practices that counter established cartographic norms, and it might unsettle some things that you've learned in this class about how to map space, about how space can be rendered on a map and what even a map can be. It can be, as I said, critical, creative, and really imaginative. So I think counter-cartographies offer alternative ways of exploring the space that's around us and interpreting in different ways the worlds that we experience in embodied and subjective ways. So I'll go through a couple of examples that I find really exciting. Again, there are many, many more that I'm not going to get to today. But if you know of some that excite you, feel free to write some comments on this page here and embed resources that you find exciting. I'll talk a bit about what I'm up to, and then I'll offer an activity that you're welcome to do in your own time. So I'll begin with psychogeography. Psychogeography was developed in France in the 1950s and 60s by kind of an eclectic group of intellectuals and artists and even performers, and they would practice dérive or drifting. And so they would walk around cities without a map, without a destination, and see how the infrastructure, really the vibes of the neighborhoods pushed and pulled them in different directions. And then they remapped the neighborhoods according to these pulls. Guy Debord was one of the famous psychogeographers, and he defined it as a qualitative investigation of the psychological effects of an urban environment on the flaneur, or the drifter, the wanderer. And as Maisie Ridgway says, it's a political statement, defiance of the capitalist system, a seizure of power in the mode of play. Well, she says, and a mode of play, but I like to think of it as a seizure of power through the mode of play, and play as kind of a method, a way of reimagining how we can move through space. Day to day, we're so caught up in getting from A to B, having a destination, having a time that we have to get there. We look on Google Maps, when is the bus coming? What's the most efficient route? And we lose the element of play, of taking our time, of walking for leisure, for the pure pleasure of just wandering around. Psychogeography embraces disoriented discovery, inviting the flaneur, the flaneuse, to become lost. It's a reclamation of power, really. And I'll zoom in here, but you can click it. It goes to the Maisie Ridgway's article, but this is one of their famous maps. They really cut apart the map of the city and then used arrows with the thickness representing like how much they felt pulled in this direction. I think it's quite a counter cartography. Can you imagine getting a map, one of those ones you can get by like Waterfront Station or by the SkyTrain, and like cutting up your map and reorganizing it maybe according to places that you feel the most emotion or places that you have a mental map of. So you can remap what has already been mapped, and that itself is a counter cartography, as is the practice of walking around in a leisurely manner without maybe having a destination. So the map can even represent a getting lost, which I think is very counter to what we think maps are supposed to do. They're supposed to guide us to a destination, not make us feel lost or disoriented. So a question I'll pose to you is, when is the last time you did walk around without a destination? And do you walk around your neighborhoods? Do you feel a sense of belonging to the place around you, and what elements make you feel at home? Do you sense or experience a shift between different neighborhoods in Vancouver? Maybe between Kitsilano, between Point Grey, downtown, and how do you know when you've left one neighborhood and moved into another? Like, is it the architecture? Is it the way houses are separated by gates or hedges or not? Are the people different? I know there are like stereotypes or, about different places in Vancouver, different neighborhoods. And I thought this is a fun map to share. If you zoom in and out, people have just added names, most of them with good intent, of different neighborhoods. They've obviously categorized everybody as suits, rich, hip, tourist, or student. Yeah, there's much more nuance in the kinds of people that live here, but I thought this was funny. And I also felt like I understood the different names, like they made sense to me. Like I could understand why someone was calling, this area hip or whatnot. And that made me realize that I have lived in Vancouver long enough to understand maybe like a bit of the essence of a place, or a bit of, what it feels like to be in a certain neighborhood. And then you can compare that maybe to areas of the city and how they are strictly defined and bounded by, the city of Vancouver. And maps are everywhere. This I found on my fridge from, the garbage collection, another way of segmenting the city, different neighborhoods, different trash pickup zones. Yeah, I'm like disorienting everyone by going so quickly. Another kind of counter mapping, a counter map itself, a counter cartography, is a disorientation guide. They counter the conventional college orientation guide, which is a map or a brochure curated by the institution itself, which orients new students to the institution in a manner in which they control. Disorientation guides, on the other hand, are multimedia issues like zines or pamphlets or even digital, short books published by student bodies that highlight conflicts in university messaging and curricula, and they protest injustice at institutions of higher education at large. Disorientation guides originated in the United States in the 1960s, protesting university investment in the Vietnam War. Again, you're welcome to grab the link at the top and move around the presentation, taking your time. I haven't structured it as a PowerPoint because that really gives a linear direction to your navigation of this lecture. So feel free to move around as you please. Deep mapping is something that I've gotten really into recently. Again, it is more of a practice like psychogeography, and it can yield counter maps, creative maps, cartographies, but it is really a practice of being present in a landscape and experiencing the space around you at a deeper level than just maybe the base map, which might be, you know, roads and buildings and whatnot, but like what else is in the landscape? What else makes a space, like sounds, smells, textures, you know. This is a picture I took down by Jericho Beach. It says, "What do you see? Many stories exist in the landscape." And it is, I need to get my charger. As many stories exist within the landscape, and then it's this open box and you get to see the landscape through it, but it gets you thinking, like, a map can only, a two-dimensional map can only tell one story. And often we're good at acknowledging that there are more, you know, perspectives that aren't being included. But deep mapping is a practice of recognizing maybe alternate realities, alternate experiences in a place, and all the different like sensory inputs beyond the visual that are present in the area that we're trying to map. And I think about it, and many others do, as like depth or verticality, like you're expanding the different layers, the dimensions of a place. And so for me, my practice of deep mapping involves a lot of walking around, a lot of sitting and observing people around me, different movements, different sounds. It's been a very enjoyable practice. And it can be like, you know, including dérive and wandering, and allowing yourself to be disoriented and open to like discovering what else is around that you might not have known when you're just going, you know, towards a destination in mind, and you're not as open to what can happen along the way, the journey. Speaking of bringing other perspectives into our maps, participatory mapping and volunteer geographic information have been gaining popularity. Participatory mapping can be many different things, and you can be critical of its application, like how much power do people actually have by participating in the process? Like, how much is their knowledge brought in and applied to the final product, whatever the map is, or like the zoning, the building, whatever project is being done. This video down here, you're welcome to click on it. It is like 7 minutes talking about hazard mapping, and the community actually created like a hand-drawn map of hazard areas from experience knowledge, and that was integrated with a GIS generated map of hazard zones. Querying the map, I'll click it so we can see. Querying the map, it is, let's see if it loads. It is volunteered information of queer experiences all around the world. And it can be really empowering if you live in a place that you don't feel has a queer community or others perhaps like yourself. And a lot of the shared stories can be very touching, these just like tender moments on this map. So it is like very vulnerable. No one's name is associated with it, but location is given, perhaps by the people that, you know, decide to submit a pin. So critiques of this are, you know, it still uses the base map, and perhaps it like shares information that the other party in the experience might not want it to be, you know, like located physically in space. But it is a very powerful map, and I suggest, if you'd like, you know, to go around, and there's lots of pins in Vancouver and all around Canada and North America and even farther. Radical cartography for me is still under this umbrella of counter cartographies, but some counter cartographers assume the identity or title of like being a radical cartographer or producing radical cartography. An Atlas of Radical Cartography came out in 2007, and it was a collection of like creative writing pieces or like mapping narratives, as well as some counter maps. And it includes everything from like mapping trash and like things that you wouldn't think are being mapped with like social political critique. And the Atlas really bridges like art, design, cartography, geography, activism, all these different spheres coming together in mapping. And then Bill Rankin's map of Vancouver roads, I'll zoom in so you can see. So his legend over here has the title, is it a road, is it a street, what's it called, and then its color, and then it's mapped over here. And I think it's very neat that you can still see the outline of Vancouver, of Richmond, of the North Shore, and it's just in roads. And these like negative spaces, these white spaces, point to, you know, places that don't have roads. So you can make out like the endowment lands, the Stanley Park and Queen Elizabeth Park. And if you can, you reflect and realize you are quite familiar with the landscape here. Speaking of reflecting on what you're familiar with, mental maps. We use mental maps, right, to navigate as we become spatially aware, either through walking or taking the bus or repetition. We get more comfortable, and that feels empowering. Often feeling lost feels disempowering. And then perhaps you have a map where you gain more spatial awareness and you know where you are, you can orient yourself. You feel a bit more power because you're not lost, right? You can move to a direction that you want to. Mental maps are subjective, embodied, and shaped through like emotions or repetitions. Perhaps if you think of Vancouver in your mind, or if you try to sketch it out as a hand-drawn map, you might notice that places you have more, you know, memories in, or like attachment to, or places you go very often spring to mind very quickly. And then, you know, you kind of fill in the spaces in between as best you can. And notice, like, draw that map and then compare it to Google Maps and see what's different. But Google Maps is not going to render like your map of Vancouver. Your map of Vancouver is very subjective and embodied, and that makes it really, in my opinion, no less accurate. And then map art. Dennis Wood has a whole collection of an atlas, really, of maps of his neighborhood. And that's called Everything Sings. I highly recommend going into his website here and looking around. Hand Drawn Map Association has some great maps. These are mental maps of the pandemic. Slight technical difficulties. But they're mostly hand-drawn maps by people and a quick blurb that was submitted and then collected here in some really, really beautiful work. And these are all counter cartographies for me because they are creative. They run counter to what we think of as a map, but we can expand what we think of as a map and use all the skills that you might have on hand, Illustrator, ArcGIS, and then any other creative or not creative skills you have, like woodworking skills or food cooking skills, right? Counter mapping can be done by anyone. And I think that's where the power lies. They can be mixed media. So you see we have like a hemlock acorn, and we have some pictures, and then some drawing, and maybe like me, this is where I am, like orienting the reader. This is where the author is. And then Larissa Fussler. To me, this is like a kind of psychogeography in that what Fussler does is sits in busy like city squares and then writes down all these observations of people moving around and what she sees. And so it's, instead of like engaging in the hustle and bustle of the city, is taking a step back and sitting down and observing all that is moving around you. Really, really intricate. And I think this is another way to express the multiple stories that are in a landscape, like annotating the map, adding more, adding what you think about what you are experiencing around you to even the base map. So a counter cartography, I guess, could be taking, a tourist map or a map of Vancouver and then maybe walking around and like annotating it. What else is there? What else are you experiencing? And through you can be interpreted into the map. Geopoetics, I think, are really great. I think poetry can be a counter cartography and a map itself because it's writing that's really spatial, right? It uses space on the page. It's not like conventional papers, academic papers, or writing that, uses this part of the page and then there's the margin, but like poetry and creative writing engage the space to add suspense, to add like time to integrate emotions or whatever has been evoked by the words on the page. And also geopoetics are a kind of geography. It's like writing about the earth and writing about landscape, about like environment, and it can add to a map of a place if you're so inclined to write creatively. I wanted to introduce Malia Acker, who did a PhD in geopoetics, and she has this chapter called Lyric Geography and Geopoetics in Practice. And these are some excerpts you're welcome to read through. But she says that her geographical practice acknowledges walking through places and charting her feelings and the ways that she interacts with people. And this is both a creative practice and a turn towards dwelling at home, towards choosing to engage with place rather than distance herself from it. And I think sometimes maps distance the audience from a place and allow them to like walk, just through it. But with like deep mapping and with Larissa Fussler's practice of like sitting in a square, you are engaging with a place rather than just walking through it and being a bit more distanced. Is there any more I'm missing? All right. So then I'll introduce a bit of what I do. My work is still a work in progress. I'm a first year master's student, but for my undergrad, I did a project called Mapping COVID-19 Creative and Critical Cartography of the Pandemic. And one thing I did was psychogeography, but I wasn't in an urban landscape. I was really isolated in rural Maine. And so I developed this concept of isolation psychogeography, which is really just like nature bathing, and getting lost close to home. So I did a lot of walking in the woods. At first, I just, went on paths. I didn't really know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't get that lost because I was close to home. And over time, I found the paths. I learned to navigate the landscape without a map. And it was a great way to think, and it was a very enjoyable practice. And you're welcome to read through here. I offer like a nature meditation, kind of like really mixed media. I have some pictures, I have some text, and then I even have a map. So I used ArcGIS to create a shapefile of the path that I walked, that I just drew. I created a shapefile, right? And then I exported it and brought it into ArcGIS online into story maps here. And I added little stops. And then I wrote some geopoetics and creative writing. And I included some pictures I took. And as you scroll through, you're like brought along my navigation. And I taught myself how to use like story maps, ArcGIS online. If you have a license through UBC, you can play around with it yourself. The platform is very like user friendly. It's very friendly to people who don't have, like skills yet in this. It's actually more friendly than like ArcGIS Pro. And because you all are able to use that, you'll have no trouble just exploring these other ways of mapping. Oh, I forgot how much fun I had making this. I was really into soil, still am. All different kinds of soil and how it smells in spring. These are things that it's hard to bring to just a two-dimensional map. I sketched this in a moment of procrastination. It's just a quick sketch of how I get around Vancouver and using what kind of transport: boat, bike, walking, bus, unicycle, car, SkyTrain. I definitely walk the most, followed by biking and bus. SkyTrain once in a while, boat whenever I'm going to the North Shore, and then I bike all the way to the lighthouse. I enjoy biking. And this was in addition to my undergrad thesis. This was made, like May of the second year. We were in isolation, but I was looking back over all the prominent events that had occurred in the first year I lived in the United States. It was quite a lot. It still is a lot. And hand-drawn maps can help interpret and make sense of otherwise unmappable things. How do we make sense of like space changing when we're like distanced from people? We move around people in different ways now on the sidewalk. And then, we can Zoom with people, we can text with people. So space is also collapsing and it's expanding. And this is like a difficult thing to think about as geographers and cartographers, if you're interested. Also, a little mindscape area that I'm working on for deep mapping. So I want to ask you all, if you're still tuned in, if there are any people or methods, practices that stood out to you, and what kinds of places, spaces, navigations would counter cartographies be well suited for? And again, you're welcome to add here. You can, like in Miro, just add like a post-it note or a little text. You're welcome to add your name or not, and just have these questions in the back of your mind. So the activity for the people who came in person was to create a counter map of the UBC geography building, or what it's like to be in UBC geography. But for you all, I really encourage you to take any of these practices out on a walk out in the world with you, and see what it's like to derive, what it's like to map deeply. And then perhaps you make a hand-drawn map or a little geopoem, or a disorientation guide even. And then you're welcome to upload that here on Miro, a little picture of that. And if you want, give a title. You're welcome to attach your name to it. You're not obligated to. And then maybe a blurb of your concept, your methods, and the medium of your map, and how your experience was practicing counter cartography and creating a counter map. That's all I have for you this evening. My email is on this presentation. You're welcome to reach out if you have any other questions, or yeah. And I wish you all the best with the rest of your term, and good luck on your final projects.